waterfalls, and it's important to see the gorillas. This list, there are three kind of conventional PowerPoints in here, but I promise that's all. But this list is basically the problem the industrial age university, the research university, was designed to solve. A list of things that this research university was designed for in the late 19th century. Paying attention, timeliness, right? The school bell becomes the metaphor and the symbol of public education in the 19th century. Because why? Because if you're a farmer, right, you get up with the sun. If your horse needs shoeing, you shoe the horse. If you notice there's a hole in the fence, you fix the fence, right? You have to school people to a world where if they're not delivering certain kinds of actions on time in an assembly line, the whole operation stops. And that goes all the way up to the development of MBA programs and other professional programs at the end of the 19th century. Standards and the very quick, and I'll tell a little story about this later, very quick blending of standards into standardization and confusion, which of course is now our national educational policy, right? No Child Left Behind is end of grade testing, standardized testing. We all know it doesn't really test anything except the ability to take tests, and that's our national educational policy. Hierarchy, who's standing at the front, who's giving orders, specialization, expertise, and credentialing, all of which start happening at the end of the 19th century. Metrics, the statistics, standard deviation, the science of counting becomes extremely important, basically from about 1885 to 1920, with many of the rules that become things that are now what we're familiar with now. And the two cultures, a division that Galileo and Newton and even Einstein wouldn't recognize, where you have to say there's science and technology on the one side and the humanities on the art and the arts on the other, and they are inseparable. Just completely divided. Right? That's another one of those things that for a digital age, a do-it-yourself digital age, doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. Two, and I'm going to just talk very briefly about William James and Frederick Winslow Taylor, but they're the two kind of, I think, two of the most important industrial age thinkers about attention. James whines in chapter 11 of Principal Psychology that he's the first person in English to write about attention. And that's kind of amazing even to think about. And then he has this great phrase about how it's important, he doesn't use the word minimize, but it's important to consider, quote, what the French call distraction. The whole idea of distraction that we have now, we had to borrow it from the French, right? That's pretty interesting. And then Taylor, very shortly after, takes that idea of attention and mechanizes it and quantifies it. Here's just I know you all know Taylor, but just a funny quote from some of Taylor's time and motion studies, just to get the formula. How long does it take a laborer with a wheelbarrow full of loose dirt to wheel it approximately 100 feet, exactly 240 times in a 10-hour day? And Taylor thought there should be quotas for what that work was, for any job, and penalties for what he called malingerers and loafers, and rewards for what he called soldiers. That's a whole other discussion, the militarism of management and the labor force. These are just some of the things that get invented for the industrial age, and I'm convinced they go together. I talk about this at length in Now You See It, the way the professionalization of the MBA and the School of Education. I think Penn is the first place that has an actual collegiate-based MBA program in the 1890s. Go hand in hand with the invention of grading, Mount Holyoke in the 1890s, with IQ tests. Starts in France, not intended to be IQ tests. You all know that story, I'm sure, about how their Binet means them to be. He was asked by the French government, since he realized phrenology wasn't exactly right. He moved, he's totally untrained, literally. And he's asked by the French government to come up with a test that'll help students who are struggling with academic subjects. Comes up with a test. He says explicitly, this is not a test for any innate intelligence, it's just an aptitude. It comes to America, very quickly becomes a test for native intelligence that of course is given to soldiers in World War I to decide who goes to the front, who's not fit to go to the front, and who shouldn't be in the military at all. Language is not taken into account, of course, so Jews and Italians and Eastern Europeans have lower IQ, right? They don't do well on these tests, doesn't matter if they're immigrants, right? And suddenly this gets transformed into policy that applies to immigration, that applies into naturalization, all kinds of prejudices that are deep in the American psyche. But my favorite of all, and this was my editor that asked me about this, he said, okay, you whine all the time about multiple choice tests, and I personally hate multiple choice tests. I don't do well on them. I'll just say that up front. Many people do, it's fine if you do. You know, I've met many people who say, I would never have gone to college if it weren't for those silly tests that I did well on. So they're fine, but my editor said, who invented the multiple choice test? It never even occurred to me that someone had invented a multiple choice test. Yeah, Frederick J. Kelly, 1914, men are at war, women are in the factories, there's no one to teach, immigrants are coming to America, there's a new rule requiring two years of secondary education. He says, we have a crisis, but Henry Ford is producing Model Ts on an assembly line. So I've come up with this test. This was his doctoral dissertation at Emporia State University. I've come up with this kind of test. It's called the item response test, or the Kansas silent reading test. And it can turn out tests of lower order thinking for the lower orders, quote unquote, the same way we can turn out Model Ts. And it'll get us through this crisis. Here's one of the questions. And if you're helping a kid study right now for a multiple choice test, this is not going to be familiar, be so strange. It's from the first Kansas silent reading test in his dissertation. Circle which one of these animals is not a farm animal. Is a farm animal. Cow, dog, crocodile, dinosaur. I mean, it's basically the same. And time. You're not allowed to make marks outside the little circle. It's basically the test our kids are taking today. Now, what kind of institution of testing is it that tells kids, first of all, a dog seems to me like a farm animal. So that's one thing, right? You're already asking kids to sort of conceal their knowledge in order to get the right answer on the test. Two, if my kid goes home and types in farm animals on his computer, he's going to get, and I did it, he's going to get 22 million hits, right? A list of 20. How does ABCD possibly prepare kids for the world they have to face today? You know, how does that teach them how to browse, how to decide how the abundance of information in the world should be sorted? What's credible and not credible? How you take information and combine it for new purposes? What your responsibility is to contributing to that knowledge, right? There's huge questions that have nothing to do with ABCD, which Frederick Kelly renounced within 4 years after the test. He went on to become the president of the University of Idaho, where he tried a new method that was diametrically opposed to multiple choice testing. He got fired by his faculty who said, no, we like this idea, we like that other idea. He was trying to do a kind of Dewey-esque, more integrated curriculum, and they got him out of there very quickly. But here we have this test that's still our national legacy. In the course of writing Now You See It, I decided I wanted to meet people, both some famous people like Jimmy Wales. I spent an afternoon with Jimmy Wales, who of course is the inventor of Wikipedia. And that was interesting, and with Tim Berners-Lee too, who did that person who wrote HTML for the World Wide Web. And both of them, I said, did you know? And they said, we had no idea, right? Jimmy Wales said until it started happening, he had no idea. Nothing in the world's idea of human nature prepared him for the biggest encyclopedia the world has ever known, contributed by voluntary labor, for free, with no rules, with people editing one another, and that now the American Library Association says is as accurate as any other compendium of knowledge available. I have huge admiration for the American Library Association. If anyone should be taking an institution and defending it, it should be the American Library Association. And instead, they've changed a position and said, no, this is something amazing. And in fact, there are all kinds of, I spent the last 2 days with the Mellon Foundation project, talking about what kinds of projects we can peer review and crowdsource together. Some amazing things are happening that are very scholarly, like the Transcribing Bentham Project, which is a project where people around the world, like Wikipedia, are transcribing Bentham's voluminous, the man wrote a lot, voluminous manuscripts, and using each other to correct and make scholarly additions. But I also, in addition to people like that, I also talked to very ordinary people who actually had made significant changes in their lives and their institutions, kind of on their own, like basically going on the internet and finding out how to do it. Or had come up with different concepts of human nature than they were supposed to have and made something amazing happen. One of them has actually since gotten a lot of attention. Thorkel Sone is somebody who has a company called Specialistern, which is he's a software manufacturer. He also has a son who's severely autistic, but who loves reading software code. And Sony changed his business. He's now got a new business that only employs autistic people as software performance testers. Something that cannot be done by a computer, but requires enormous attention to the details of a huge, long series of numbers. And because the people who work in Specialistern had no chance of an occupation before, suddenly they make good salaries, right? It's a social problem, not just a cognitive problem, it's a social problem. They're the best testers in the business. There are versions of Specialistern now starting in countries all over the world that are using the same thing. What he's doing, he also has to find mediators who are basically social translators, not only for the autistic community working with so-called NTs, which is the autistic term for neurotypicals or normal people, but also the autistic people can't figure out why the NTs are so lazy, so distracted, why they spend all their time gossiping in the hall and complaining. They've got good jobs with good work, and it's interesting and fascinating. What's wrong with these people? So they have to employ, he has to employ NTs to sort of tell the autistic people, yeah, I know they're inferior people out there, but we have to be kind to the NTs. they have other functions, even though they're really terrible at software performance testing. Another person is somebody I follow on Twitter. His name is Tough Love for X. Tough Love for X is a retired printer, it turns out. I started following him because I was interested in the connection between education and cognition and institutions and technology, and this guy on Twitter seemed always to have a link to the article that just rocked my world. So I DM'd him. If you don't do Twitter, that means a direct message. I DM'd Tough Love for X one day and said, who are you? You are the smartest person out there, and I think I've read everybody in this field, and you are just out there. And he's like, I was a depressed retired guy. And I really believe high school education is broken and it has to be fixed. And I was thinking one day, well, I read about this a lot. Maybe I'll use this new thing, Twitter, to tell people a little about what I'm reading. He's followed now by about 4,000 people. He also follows 4,000 people. Who has time to follow 4,000 people? He not only follows, he is this amazing filter. Who follows him? Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education. Diane Ravitch, who hates Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education. This whole we wait for what Tough Love tells us to read. Tough Love, he used to work, he's a printer, and Tough Love for X is Tough Love for Xerox. He loves Xerox, and they changed their retirement policies, and he started a blog critical of their retirement policies. And then he went to Twitter, and Twitter cuts you off, your name off, so instead of Tough Love for Xerox, he became Tough Love for X. But he's a policymaker. It's free. He's doing something important in the world. He's shaping a world. My third one is my favorite in some ways. I was trying to figure out a trade that seemed least likely to be affected by the digital world we live in, and this new form of collaborative, combined attention, and the possibilities of a new way of working collaboratively together. And I thought, well, the building trades are probably the most static, and the ones that would be most resistant. And then driving my car, and NPR comes on, and there's an interview with this guy from Greensboro, North Carolina. Not a mecca, not a center of culture, as we know it. And Dennis Quaintance is a developer in Greensboro who has built this hotel called the Proximity Hotel, and he's telling his story. At age 40, he and his wife had twins. And they were walking the twins by the riverbank, on the riverbank one day and said, well, they'd be proud of us when they grow up. And they said, sure, you know, I'm successful. Dennis said, I'm successful, I've built all these buildings, I've done all these good things. And his wife then said, is everyone okay? It's okay? Okay. How have we, what kind of earth have we left them? Have we done anything good about the planet? And Dennis realized he never even thought about it before. So he had a $30 million contract to build a hotel. He called the 60 workers that he's closest to and that he's worked with before and said, look, we're going to build the most sustainable hotel we can possibly build. So you, electrician, you go out and find out. Go on the internet, find out what you can find out about sustainable electric. You who's doing the HVAC system, you find out about that. He called it Toilet of a Week because they found all these sustainable toilets and then they would all bring them to their houses and test them. You know, these are not engineers, they're not trained architects, these are local craftspeople, in the building trade, learning how to do this. He did also an important thing as the CEO. He said, I'm going to assume the risk in this. Normally, we'd have a cost-plus contract. That means, you know, if you go over in time or over in money, you not only pay that, you pay a penalty. He's like, if you come up with something sustainable, I'm going to get rid of the plus part. But you still have, you know, you'll still be, you know, you have to keep a budget. But I will absorb I won't have a special penalty on top. The way it would be if you brought an unsustainable product. Do what you can. I interviewed the workers. They were all very skeptical, but they tried it. They had nothing to lose. They not only built this hotel that would be beautiful by New York standards, which I'm a design snob. I was shocked when I went into this hotel. Not only does it feel like no building you've ever been in before, you feel like you're at the beach and you realize you've never been in a building with clean air, with breezes that blow through it. I mean, it's an amazing feeling. It's the world's only platinum LEED certified hotel. 60 people in Greensboro, the world's only, learning it themselves and doing it themselves, the world's only platinum LEED. LEED is an environmental designation for sustainability. Stands for leadership and environmental, someone know what that, anyway, LEED. When I said, what was his lesson from that? He said, the crazy thing is it wasn't that hard. And he said, that makes me happy, and it makes me really sad. The happy part is because they did it, right? 60 guys and 60 men and women in Greensboro made a platinum LEED hotel. And during the recession, which hit right after the hotel went up, they were great because people wanted to, you know, it got enormous publicity and people wanted not only to stay in that hotel because they got all this attention, but to hire those people because they're the only people in North Carolina who know how to do sustainable building. So they've actually fared very, very well in this recession. Also, it's called the proximity because they decided they had to use materials because it was sustainable from local areas. So the patenting effect institutionally for the building trade in North Carolina is huge, and for the rest of us. The sad thing he said is, why isn't everybody doing it? It's this easy. Why isn't everyone doing it? I figured it cost if the contract was for $30 million, it probably cost him $31 million, and he saved that in HVAC costs in the first year. So why, if it was that easy, why isn't everyone doing it? It's a great question. Okay. I started by asking you to write 3 things on your card, and then to talk about things about how you could make institutional change for the digital age within the world that we are all, or maybe not, I don't want to presume that many of us in this audience and in this room today are a part of, which is education. Just shout out some of the things you wrote in your card. I'm just really interested in what kind of things people might have said about education. Say it.
Open peer review for scholarly publication.
Oh, cool. Open peer. That's a sophisticated one. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Spent 2 days on that. That's a great one. Okay. Other ones.
Current problems, assignments to thinking.
Current problems.
As technological problems.
As part of what an institution, what you do as part of higher education. I love that. That's fantastic.
Polish University departments.
Which of course departments can also form
They are
alternate.
paid. They absolutely are paid.
Excellent. That's a great one too, I like that. Yes,
In K-12 education, emphasizing digital literacy skills for students, and also providing teacher education.
great. And yes, we can't expect, the punitive attitude for teachers now is appalling. Gotta get rid of that. Yes. Other things.
Have students and faculty work together to reimagine print text for digital media?
Ooh, nice. Other ones? Any other ones we haven't heard?
Equipment in the classroom, so wherever you are, and money to get the equipment, to get onto the internet.
Good, good. Anyone else? Any other ones? Yes.
A shift from data ingestion and memorization to system analysis, things that assume the data is readily available.
That's great. I think the point is that we all have these ideas. I mean, Clay Shirky made that comment about institutions tend to preserve the problems they were designed to solve. I actually think that institutions are more flexible than that, and institutions are always changing. So we all think we know what school is, and we all think we know what work is. We really only know what school and work have been for a very narrow slice and recent slice of human history. And I think, most of us know different things we can do. And in fact, most of us are doing things, maybe individually, to change and to address not the future, but the world we live in now. And I think, the smartest thing about that is going back to Dennis Clayton's comment, that the crazy thing is we can make change and we can address, we don't have to be panicked about technology destroying our brains, technology destroying us. It's a tool that technology is a tool we can not only use, but we can change our institutions so that it helps, those institutions help us to use it better. We did that with the creation of the research university in the industrial age. And I think we're on the verge of doing the same kind of thing in the present. You all have already started that process in your work lives. Clearly, CUNY Graduate School Graduate Center is already a model of this kind of thinking, and how we can get that model out for others to follow, I think, and even more. And I know you're doing this in ways large and small every day, but even more. And I think it's not only possible, but we have to do it. Changing the cost of higher education has to be way, way at the top of our list. And I think all of that is possible, and no more impossible than 60 people in Greensboro making the Proximity Hotel and getting a world's only Platinum LEED designation for it. And I think that's the deal. The crazy thing is, it's really not that hard. Thank you.
While Jesse's getting his technology set up, I wanted to let you know that Now You See It is for sale outside as you walk out the door. And there's also a reception, a wine and cheese reception upstairs. You're all invited after the Q&A. It's in room 5307. Hopefully, when you get up to the 5th floor, there'll be some signs directing you there. And maybe you can even get Kathy to sign your book up there. So we're going to have her whisk her off to the 5th floor so she can get a drink that she's earned. But you can buy your book on the way out. And also, I guess I didn't really formally introduce Jesse Prince, but I'd like to thank him for agreeing to do this. He was a discussant last year also for Emily Martin, and was quite a stellar discussant. I know he's going to do the same for Kathy. Professor Prince is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy here at the Graduate Center, and he's author of, I think we're up to 5 books, right, Jesse? You're 5 books. One of them is called The Conscious Brain. That's his latest. That's coming out soon. And I think he's got 2 or 3 more in the pipe. So pretty soon he'll have a list as long as Kathy's. Really excited. Thank you, Jesse.
I didn't know about that. It's really a pleasure to be here. Kathy and I have some history. I was at North Carolina, the competitor for Duke, but those who know the Carolinas will know that the competition is only in sport. And I, before that, worked at Washington University, which was the undergraduate alma mater of Dan Simons, who did the gorilla experiment. So I knew Dan from back then in his first explorations of the hidden gorilla. What I want to do is talk a little bit about an attitude that I think we just saw beautifully exhibited in Kathy's talk, but also very much the center of her book. And it's a kind of technoptimism, which is an ugly coinage that refers to a kind of optimism about technology. And there's a real can-do attitude where, look, we have this major revolution and we have to work with it, and there are a lot of good things we can do with it. And the book is really a wonderful, which maybe has been called a manifesto. It is that. It's a manifesto that tells us how we can positively affect our lives through technology. And I think she's right to see a lot of good there. So as you might forecast from the picture, this is going to be somewhat of a downward spiral. But I want to begin by talking a little bit about the good. And the book is a marvelous read, among other things, because it really does profile very concrete cases where technology is being used in good ways. Just to give some other examples, this is a neuroimaging study that shows the brain of a person while reading on the left and while looking at a web page on the right. And this is somebody familiar with technology, and you can see for those who have had some exposure to the internet, there's in fact, it's a little hard to read off this picture, but twice the level of neural activity while we look at a web page as opposed to a page of printed text. And this was actually some work done by a guy named Gary Small, who was doing this in a geriatric context, so was interested in using technology to improve the amount of brain activity to lengthen high levels of cognitive performance in the later years of life. So that's a positive payoff. If you look at various cognitive abilities, this is from one of Kathy's colleagues, Steve Mitroff, a psychologist who's done a lot of work on the cognitive effects of video games. Another important technology that gets discussed in the book. You can see that various things are improved. Don't worry about reading the tables, but the key thing to notice is that all of these graphs measure some degree of cognitive performance, and in each case you can see those who have experience playing video games are shifted slightly to the right, which means improved levels of performance on these various tasks. And Mitroff actually does this stuff with Tetris as his control condition. And the game that really has a big impact is Doom or some other shoot-'em-up game. So violent video games are making us cognitively superior. So that's reassuring. It's an old axiom in psychology. This has been known for decades, long before technology became an important player, that something called depth of processing or levels of processing improves retention. So if you give somebody a written word and just have them describe the font, they're not going to remember it that well. If you have them sound out the word in their heads, they'll remember it a little bit better. And if you have them think about the meaning, they'll remember it better than that. It doesn't matter which task you add, just giving them a little further bit of engagement with that word improves their attention. Adding pictures has a huge effect. You can imagine the multimedia experience on the internet really radically increasing our capacity to store information. So that's positive. Now, I'm a cineast, I'm a cinephile, I like film. And one of the wonderful things that technology has done here moving into the web is it's just a huge compendium of information. And it's very decentralized. So you can get information from people who are not maybe the major studios who are interested in selling you their films, but from independent filmmakers and film fans. So on a site like Mubi, you can go watch films, some of which will be familiar to people in this room. So how many of you have heard of Un Chien Andalou? Okay, so very, very famous surrealist film. The General with Buster Keaton, Tarkovsky's The Mirror, one of the great films of the recent Russian cinema. And any cinephile in the room will know The Mirror. I mean, that's just a very familiar reference. But if you move down the page, films by Ning Ying. How many have heard of Ning Ying? Anyone? So films by Nina Menkes. Anyone? So these are film festivals that you can watch online, feature films made by these filmmakers who are operating outside of the mainstream. and producing really artistically important work. And we only gain access to this by the internet. These things are not coming to a theater near you. Maybe most importantly, there is a sense in which the availability of the web just vastly expands our knowledge store. In not just the retention way, this old school way that I mentioned before, where we store stuff better in our brains, but the internet becomes part of our brain. There's a sense in which Google is part of it. So a couple of philosophers, Dave Chalmers at NYU and Andy Clark, my former colleague, have this idea of the extended mind. The basic idea is, how do you call up a memory in your head? Well, basically, you sort of feed yourself a few key words, and then suddenly that memory pops up and you can report it. Well, that's just the way we gain access to information using a Google search. And there's a sense in which Google, because it's with us all the time, how many of you have a PDA with you right now? So your brain is as big as the internet. You can right now look up any fact that's available on, say, Wikipedia or one of these sources, and that's vastly expanded the power of the human mind. So our minds are now enormous, and they're overlapping. My mind contains part of your mind in quite a literal way. That's quite exciting. But there's some bad news, and part of the bad news involves a central trope in Kathy's book. So I want you to look at this display, and I want you to count how many times the white polygons make contact with the side of the screen. They're going to start moving around. Okay? Try really hard, you'll be tested. So how many times?
8.
15? Anyone get over 15? Hyperactive intellect? I have no idea what the actual number is. How many how many of you saw the Red Cross? How many of you did not see the Red Cross? Anyone? Okay, so a few of you did not see the Red Cross. I'm going to play it again. And that's about consistent with the results. This is a Steve Most experiment, and about 20% of this condition failed to see a red cross that moves across the center of the screen. It's there for 5 seconds. It's a different color, shape, hue, value level. It's moving at a different trajectory. In every major visual way, it's different from the surrounding objects, but many people fail to see it. This is just the gorilla. So if this is a boring academic version of the gorilla is sort of bells and whistles. This is the effect really distilled to polygons. What it should suggest is that attention is this very valuable resource for seeing. And Kathy uses that as a positive metaphor in the book, that we need to be wary that our traditional ways of doing things are making us blind to new alternatives. But we also need to think of attention as something that might be adversely affected by technology. Just to give you one more demonstration of how important attention is, the lighting is a little bad here, but I'm going to just start this spinning, and I want you to stare at the little center blinking dot and see if those yellow dots disappear. Just stare at the blinking dot. Are the yellow dots disappearing?
Yes.
Now those yellow dots are there the whole time. They're not actually going anywhere. The yellow dots are, this is not a trick. So the yellow dot, if you don't believe me, I'll play it again. Stare at just one particular yellow dot. Just pick a yellow dot of your choice and stare at that. And if you stare at any particular yellow dot, you'll see it remains in place. So what's going on here is attention is being distracted by that blue grid in the background. And when that happens, we're literally rendered blind. Attention is essential for conscious experiences, essential for seeing. So depletion of attention can literally make us blind. One of the anxieties, and I agree with Kathy that it's somewhat overplayed, but one of the anxieties associated with technology is that it's reducing our capacity to attend, and it's reducing our attention span. So studies on attention suggest that within a 45-minute period, people zone out about every 5.4 minutes. So how many of you are zoned out right now? Probably in a room of this size, at least one of you. Some of you are lying. I'm sure you spaced out at some point over the course of the last hour, and that's something we do typically. What if that starts to happen more frequently? The average time spent on a web page is about 8 seconds. What if that hypertext experience starts to make us so fickle with attention that we can no longer even maintain attention for 5 minutes. Is that going to have an adverse impact on our capacity to see? There's a potential risk there. Again, don't worry too much about looking at the data here. So there is some research suggesting that attention is being adversely affected by the technologies we use. So here's something just looking at television and video game exposure. And in the little pink square there, you can see a correlation between exposure to these media and problems with attention. So there are some concerns there. Another concern on graphs like this, so if you look at attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you do seem to see an upward slope in diagnosis. It's not clear whether the condition is increasing or people are just diagnosing it more often, but the fact that you see ADHD on the rise is potentially a cause for alarm, because what could be causing this syndrome to increase? One possible explanation is that technology is playing a role. Now, I can't resist a footnote, which is this: ADHD is a myth. Okay? So this is a controversial thing to say, that's why I said it in my hush voice. But ADHD may not be a real syndrome, which is not to say that it's fake or people are making it up. But it is to say that the range of symptoms that are used for diagnosis might not form a coherent bundle. They might be a lot of independent symptoms. Those of you familiar with cladistics or diagnostic methods used by the DSM will know that the way you get diagnosed with any psychiatric condition using the DSM is by a checklist. And there are lots and lots of different ways to get up to threshold on the very same checklist. People might be diagnosed with the same disorder despite having radically different symptoms. And the very same symptoms might have radically different etiology. So I don't think ADHD is a single phenomenon. I think we'll ultimately be able to demonstrate that. But I think it is a constellation of different symptoms, many of which involve difficulties with attention. And the fact that attention seems to be impaired and it's sometimes diagnosed in something like 8% of our youth is something of an alarm. That said, I mean, a cynical view of ADHD is it's just a medicalization of childhood, which is to say that a lot of